You were taught this battle was inevitable, but that isn't what really happened. Behind every victory, Britain quietly broke the enemy's morale in ways history refuses to tell you. You were taught this. That Britain's victories on the 18th century battlefield were inevitable. That Redcoats marched, fired, and won, as if destiny itself guided them. That France and Prussia were outmatched simply because they lacked courage or skill. Let that sink in. History, as it is commonly presented, is tidy. Stories of valor and heroism fill the textbooks. Heroes are celebrated, mistakes are glossed over, and complexity is flattened into a neat, digestible narrative. But reality, as it often is far messier. It is rarely the grand tales of glory that shaped outcomes. Rather, it is the discipline, the quiet endurance, the hard graft behind the lines that determined who would prevail. You have been led to believe that France and Prussia were simply outclassed, that their armies collapsed because British firepower alone was superior, that their leaders were inept, that the result was a foregone conclusion. This, however, is the myth. The public imagination paints battles as decisive, almost cinematic in their clarity. Redcoats stand firm, the enemy falters, flags wave, drums beat. The imagery is compelling, yes, but misleading. It suggests that warfare is about numbers or mere luck, that brute force and flamboyant maneuvers decide victory. In truth, the common story omits the unseen. It leaves out the countless hours spent drilling men into synchronized units, the meticulous training in volley fire and bayonet discipline, the patience demanded of soldiers facing freezing rain, mud, or blistering sun. Britain's success was never about sheer superiority on paper. It was about preparation, focus, and psychological mastery over both men and morale. That lesson rarely reaches the surface of popular history, yet it is crucial. Without it, the myth survives, unchallenged, and misleads the observer about what truly tipped the scales. Consider the standard narrative. France and Prussia, swollen with manpower, should have been unbeatable. Their numbers were formidable, their artillery impressive, their cavalry daring. Yet the myth insists they fell before the composed, regimented British infantry. It implies that British soldiers possess some innate advantage, that they fought like clockwork automata, unerring and infallible. It glosses over the human element, the strain of marches that stretched over miles, the uncertainty of supply lines, the ever-present threat of miscommunication, and the subtle erosion of morale under pressure. It reduces the story to a simple triumph of one army over another, ignoring the delicate psychological balance maintained by discipline, leadership, and experience. This simplification is comfortable. It reassures us that history can be neat, that winners are predestined, and that chaos need not be acknowledged. But real war is rarely so tidy. And here is the key. The myth also obscures the tactical ingenuity Britain employed. Most accounts give credit to flashy maneuvers or charismatic officers, while the backbone of success, the rigorous drilling, the coordinated volleys, the integration of infantry with artillery, is barely mentioned. The public never sees how soldiers kept their heads when all around them seemed about to crumble, or how sheer endurance allowed them to outlast opponents who, by numbers alone, should have prevailed. Instead, the narrative encourages complacency in our understanding. It celebrates outcome over method, appearance over substance, legend over truth, and so we accept the story. Britain conquered because Britain was better. The psychological and operational sophistication behind that success is rarely acknowledged. Here's the part most people miss. Britain's infantry success in the 18th century was not a miracle of fate. It was the result of careful planning, exacting discipline, and a relentless commitment to order and endurance. The myth would have you believe that France and Prussia were doomed the moment they met British troops on the field. The reality was far more precarious, more complex, and far more revealing about the nature of warfare, human endurance, and the quiet authority of disciplined men. That is the story we will begin to uncover. This is where everything changes. You thought the myth was the full story. You thought Britain's victories were preordained, but there is a crack, a subtle inconsistency that most accounts gloss over. It's not in the grand movements of armies or the shining moments of heroism. It is in the quiet, overlooked details, the hesitations, the missteps, the human frailties that threaten to unravel everything. France and Prussia were not simply overpowered by British firepower. They were misjudged, and it is in that misjudgment that the myth begins to falter. Here's the part most people miss. In many battles, the numerical superiority of the French and Prussian forces was not irrelevant. It was a tangible, pressing reality. Yet, the historical narrative minimizes this advantage, implying that numbers alone are meaningless when faced with British resolve. That is misleading. The reality is that discipline, training, and coordination were constantly being tested against superior forces. Each decision, each pause in the line, each volley fired at precisely the right moment was a gamble. One misstep and the advantage could have swung entirely to the enemy. The myth would have you believe these victories were a given, as if the outcome was inscribed in the very soil of the battlefield. But that is not what happened. Consider the logistics. Supply lines were tenuous, communication was slow, orders could be delayed or misunderstood. Yet British units held their positions, maintained formation, and executed complex drills under pressure. Meanwhile, the opposing forces, despite their numbers, struggled with coordination, fatigue, and morale. And this is where the first inconsistency appears. The narrative portrays France and Prussia as incompetent or cowardly, but the truth is subtler. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and often courageous. The crack lies in the psychological dimension, the fear, the hesitation, the uncertainty that crept into their ranks when confronted with British discipline. This is rarely emphasized, because it challenges the neat story of inevitable British triumph. Another overlooked detail is the adaptation of British infantry tactics. The myth portrays their methods as static, as if drilled routines alone guaranteed success. Yet the innovation came in the careful observation of the enemy, in small tactical adjustments, in the ability to read morale and exploit weaknesses without fanfare. France and Prussia were not slow or foolish. They were, at times, predictable in their overconfidence. The crack appears not because of incompetence, but because Britain learned to anticipate arrogance and to exploit it subtly. It was a quiet, almost invisible form of psychological warfare that the myth neglects entirely. And yet, the popular version of history insists that the victory was obvious, inevitable, and simple. That is the crack's power. It exposes the lie of inevitability. Britain's advantage was not divine or miraculous. It was earned, maintained under pressure, and constantly at risk. The myth erases these moments of tension. It hides the precarious balance between order and chaos, between endurance and collapse. It leaves the audience believing that the battlefield was merely a stage for Redcoats to shine, rather than a complex theater where human psychology, discipline, and adaptability determine the outcome. And this is why that matters. Recognizing the crack forces us to reconsider who deserves credit, how victories were achieved, and what it truly meant to face a disciplined army under immense pressure. The gap between perception and reality, between legend and fact, is where the real story begins. France and Prussia were not simply outmatched by force. They were outmatched by preparation, by psychological foresight, by relentless discipline. The myth cannot hold once we see the fragility beneath the surface. And here, at the first fissure in the story, the groundwork is laid. For without understanding this crack, one cannot appreciate the full measure of what Britain accomplished, nor the human cost, the endurance, and the meticulous craft that shaped history on the battlefield. Now we step beyond the myth and the crack, into the reality that history often obscures. Britain's infantry success on the 18th century battlefield was not a matter of chance or inherent superiority. It was the product of painstaking preparation, relentless discipline, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Let that sink in. While textbooks give you the impression of decisive volleys and instant victories, the real story is far more human and far more compelling. The men of Britain's infantry endured conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. They marched through mud that sucked at their boots, across rain-slicked fields that turned formations into quagmires. They stood in freezing dawns, muskets at the ready, waiting for the moment their training could make the difference between survival and annihilation. And they kept their heads, not by luck, not by chance, by discipline. Here's the part most people miss. Each regiment functioned like a living mechanism, every soldier a critical cog. Drills were repeated until they became instinct, until the men could fire, reload, and advance in perfect synchrony even under the most harrowing fire. It was not glamorous work. It was bloody hard graft. Long hours, little rest, constant exposure to the elements. Yet these men absorbed the pressure, bore it silently, and delivered when it counted. The enemy might have had numbers, artillery, and bold maneuvers, but British soldiers had something far more difficult to quantify. Endurance under discipline. That is the reality behind the victories, often hidden by the tales that glorify the outcome while ignoring the method. Consider the isolation they faced. Many units were stretched along miles of frontier or deployed in hostile territories far from supply lines. Communication could fail at any moment. Messengers could be cut down. Yet the chain of command held. Officers led with quiet authority, and men obeyed without hesitation. This was not mindless obedience. It was a cultivated understanding that every mistake, every lapse could tip the balance. And in this environment, the British soldier learned to shoulder responsibility, to maintain composure when the enemy was pressing hard and the odds seemed stacked against them. Here, discipline became both shield and weapon. Discipline versus arrogance is the theme of this reality. the French and Prussian forces were, in many instances, confident to the point of carelessness. They relied on numbers and reputation, often underestimating the patience and precision of the Redcoats. When volleys were fired, when lines held under pressure, the psychological impact on opposing troops was profound. Momentum shifted not solely because of musket fire, but because fear and uncertainty crept into the ranks of those who assumed victory was assured. British endurance, quiet and methodical, exploited this overconfidence. That is the subtle genius that the myth rarely acknowledges, and this is why it matters. Understanding Britain's reality reframes the battles entirely. It was not luck. It was not divine favor. It was not flamboyant heroics. It was men who saw it through, who kept their heads when everything around them threatened to collapse, who repeated the same drills day after day, until their collective efficiency became an almost invisible but unstoppable force. Their success lay in preparation and mental fortitude, in exploiting what the enemy did not expect: calm, relentless order. Here's the part most people miss. Behind every British line that held, behind every musket fired in perfect rhythm, was a human story of endurance. The terrain, the weather, the constant threat of misjudgment, all of it tested the limits of the soldier. And yet, they persisted. This persistence, disciplined and quiet, created outcomes that myths oversimplify into destiny. In reality, Britain earned every yard of ground, every victory, every advantage it held over France and Prussia. This is where the battlefield comes alive, not in paintings, not in polished accounts, but in the mud, the rain, the smoke, and the fear that gripped every man. You were taught that battles were moments of glory, decisive and swift. That is the myth. The reality was far more demanding. The struggle was relentless. Soldiers waited for hours, sometimes days, in wet fields, their uniforms soaked, their feet blistered, eyes stinging from smoke and grit. The wind carried the scent of powder and earth, biting at exposed skin, and yet they held formation. Discipline became survival. Without it, even the best-trained units would have collapsed. Here's the part most people miss. The terrain itself was an enemy. Fields turned to quagmires under rainfall, hedgerows and ditches broke lines, uneven ground slowed advances. Commanders measured every step against the risk of exposure. British infantry moved with precision because they had rehearsed it endlessly, their steps, volleys, and turns drilled into muscle memory. Across the same fields, French and Prussian soldiers sometimes faltered, not through cowardice, but because fatigue, miscommunication, and poor cohesion began to sap confidence. The struggle was as psychological as it was physical. Each pause, each misfire, each hesitation weighed heavily. And yet, the British men endured, kept their heads, and pressed forward. The weather played its part with cruel impartiality. Rain could turn gunpowder useless, frost could freeze joints, sun could sap strength. Officers shouted commands over the roar of artillery and the hiss of musket fire, their voices barely reaching the men, yet every order mattered. The slightest lapse could mean catastrophe, and it was not just the enemy pressing hard, it was the environment itself testing every ounce of resolve. Soldiers relied on each other, formed lines, and executed drills with precision under conditions most would consider unbearable. That is the essence of endurance in warfare, keeping your wits when chaos surrounds you. Fear was ever present. It did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept silently, in the pounding heart, in the sweat-soaked grip on a musket, in the glance at an advancing enemy column. British soldiers acknowledged it but did not yield. They learned to channel it into discipline. Every step forward, every coordinated volley, every fixed bayonet was an act of controlled courage. Meanwhile, French and Prussian units, though equally brave, sometimes faltered under the subtle erosion of morale. The difference was preparation. The difference was the ability to absorb pressure and convert it into action rather than panic. And this is where psychological warfare quietly unfolds. Britain's advantage was rarely just in firepower. It was in the certainty of order, in the intimidating regularity of soldiers moving as one. The enemy could see the lines, anticipate the volleys, and yet still hesitate. That hesitation spread through ranks like a slow contagion. Numbers counted for nothing when fear and uncertainty undermined cohesion. Discipline in this sense became a weapon more effective than cannon or musket. It broke morale before the first fatal blow was struck. Here's the part most people miss. The struggle was cumulative. Each march, each hour in formation, each volley drilled under miserable conditions, added to the psychological weight on the opponent. By the time battle lines clashed, Britain had already gained the upper hand, not through chance, but through endurance, training, and sheer force of will. The battlefield was a theater of attrition, not merely of heroics. That is what the myth rarely shows, and this is why it matters. Observing the struggle allows us to understand that victory was never guaranteed. It was earned through persistence, unyielding discipline, and the quiet refusal to break. The terrain, weather, fatigue, and fear were all obstacles, yet British infantry pressed forward, step by step, volley by volley, until momentum shifted, often imperceptibly in their favor. That is the struggle the myth obscures, the reality that shaped history. This is where discipline proves decisive. You've followed the myth, seen redcoats as almost magical figures, and now we confront the moment reality validates their reputation. The turn is rarely loud or flamboyant. It does not announce itself with drum beats or trumpet calls. It creeps forward quietly, invisibly, until the enemy falters. The momentum of the battlefield shifts, almost imperceptibly at first, but irrevocably. Here's the part most people miss. It is not merely muskets and cannons that win the day. It is the relentless, unshakable cohesion of men who have been trained to act as one. That is where Britain's edge became undeniable. The weather, the terrain, the long marches, and the mental strain had tested both sides. By now, French and Prussian soldiers had been pushed to the limits. Their lines wavered under repeated volleys. Their commanders shouted orders that failed to reach every corner of the formation. Exhaustion weighed heavy, and overconfidence, a trait that once seemed an asset, now became a liability. The British infantry, in contrast, moved as a single organism. Each man knew his role, each step calculated, each musket fired with precision. That quiet consistency, this unglamorous mastery of drill and discipline, created a psychological weight that could not be measured in numbers alone. Here's the part most people miss. The turn was as much mental as physical. Morale is fragile, a candle in the wind. French and Prussian soldiers saw lines holding where they expected them to break. They faced coordinated volleys that arrived without hesitation. Even small miscalculations on their part were magnified under pressure. Slowly, confidence eroded. Panic does not strike suddenly. It creeps in, infecting the hesitant, the weary, the unprepared. Discipline, by contrast, builds an invisible momentum. Britain's soldiers had been immersed in it for weeks, months, sometimes years. They had trained to absorb stress, to respond predictably under chaos, to maintain order when all else threatened collapse. That was the unseen weapon that tipped the scales. The turning point was never a single heroic act, despite what paintings and popular history might suggest. It was cumulative. Every disciplined march, every timed volley, every square held against cavalry built the pressure until the enemy could no longer withstand it. France and Prussia were seasoned powers, yet arrogance and expectation blinded them to subtle cues. They underestimated the endurance of men who had learned to act as one. And that is precisely why the myth misleads. It portrays the outcome as inevitable, as if only numbers and chance mattered, when in fact the turn was a careful, deliberate orchestration of mental and physical mastery. And this is why it matters. Once the turn is underway, momentum changes rapidly, hesitation spreads, orders are misunderstood, retreats begin, sometimes quietly, sometimes chaotically. Britain's infantry, trained to maintain formation under duress, pressed forward methodically. The enemy could no longer rely on confidence or intimidation. The psychological edge had shifted entirely. The battlefield itself, once a contest of force, had become a theater of discipline and endurance. Here's the part most people miss. This shift feels inevitable in retrospect, but it was earned in blood, mud, and sheer tenacity. Britain's soldiers did not rely on luck or spectacle. They relied on training, patience, and an almost imperceptible control of momentum. Each controlled action, every volley, every step, every hold against pressure, was a brushstroke in the larger picture of victory. By the time the enemy faltered visibly, the turn had long been set in motion. And this is where the lesson becomes clear. Discipline does not merely hold lines, it creates inevitability. Endurance is not passive, it drives outcomes. Britain's infantry demonstrated that success on the battlefield was not a matter of numbers or bravado. It was earned methodically and psychologically. That is the turn, often invisible in legend but unmistakable in reality. This is where discipline proves decisive. You've followed the myth, seen redcoats as almost magical figures, and now we confront the moment reality validates their reputation. The turn is rarely loud or flamboyant. It does not announce itself with drum beats or trumpet calls. It creeps forward quietly, invisibly, until the enemy falters. The momentum of the battlefield shifts, almost imperceptibly at first, but irrevocably. Here's the part most people miss. It is not merely muskets and cannons that win the day, it is the relentless, unshakable cohesion of men who have been trained to act as one. That is where Britain's edge became undeniable. The weather, the terrain, the long marches, and the mental strain had tested both sides. By now, French and Prussian soldiers had been pushed to the limits. Their lines wavered under repeated volleys. Their commanders shouted orders that failed to reach every corner of the formation. Exhaustion weighed heavy, and overconfidence, a trait that once seemed an asset, now became a liability. The British infantry, in contrast, moved as a single organism. Each man knew his role, each step calculated, each musket fired with precision. That quiet consistency, this unglamorous mastery of drill and discipline, created a psychological weight that could not be measured in numbers alone. Here's the part most people miss. The turn was as much mental as physical. Morale is fragile, a candle in the wind. French and Prussian soldiers saw lines holding where they expected them to break. They faced coordinated volleys that arrived without hesitation. Even small miscalculations on their part were magnified under pressure. Slowly, confidence eroded. Panic does not strike suddenly. It creeps in, infecting the hesitant, the weary, the unprepared. Discipline, by contrast, builds an invisible momentum. Britain's soldiers had been immersed in it for weeks, months, sometimes years. They had trained to absorb stress, to respond predictably under chaos, to maintain order when all else threatened collapse. That was the unseen weapon that tipped the scales. The turning point was never a single heroic act, despite what paintings and popular history might suggest. It was cumulative. Every disciplined march, every timed volley, every square held against cavalry built the pressure until the enemy could no longer withstand it. France and Prussia were seasoned powers, yet arrogance and expectation blinded them to subtle cues. They underestimated the endurance of men who had learned to act as one. And that is precisely why the myth misleads. It portrays the outcome as inevitable, as if only numbers and chance mattered, when in fact the turn was a careful, deliberate orchestration of mental and physical mastery. And this is why it matters. Once the turn is underway, momentum changes rapidly, hesitation spreads, orders are misunderstood, retreats begin, sometimes quietly, sometimes chaotically. Britain's infantry, trained to maintain formation under duress, pressed forward methodically. The enemy could no longer rely on confidence or intimidation. The psychological edge had shifted entirely. The battlefield itself, once a contest of force, had become a theater of discipline and endurance. Here's the part most people miss. This shift feels inevitable in retrospect, but it was earned in blood, mud, and sheer tenacity. Britain's soldiers did not rely on luck or spectacle. They relied on training, patience, and an almost imperceptible control of momentum. Each controlled action, every volley, every step, every hold against pressure, was a brushstroke in the larger picture of victory. By the time the enemy faltered visibly, the turn had long been set in motion. And this is where the lesson becomes clear. Discipline does not merely hold lines, it creates inevitability. Endurance is not passive, it drives outcomes. Britain's infantry demonstrated that success on the battlefield was not a matter of numbers or bravado. It was earned methodically and psychologically. That is the turn, often invisible in legend but unmistakable in reality. And this is where the results of discipline and endurance become undeniable. The consequences of the turn on the battlefield were immediate, striking, and, in many ways, irreversible. France and Prussia, despite their numbers and reputation, began to crumble under pressure. The moment hesitation seeped into their ranks, cohesion faltered. Units that had seemed solid a few hours earlier now wavered, eyes darting for leadership that struggled to project certainty. That is the part most people miss. Collapse is rarely sudden. It is gradual, psychological, and cumulative, and by the time the enemy realized what was happening, it was often too late. Here's the part most people miss. The collapse of morale did not merely cost ground, it redefined strategy. Commanders were forced to react defensively, abandoning offensive plans. Cavalry charges were called off. Artillery positions were shifted hurriedly, disrupting coordination. Every move the British infantry made seemed measured, inevitable, and yet it was the enemy who now reacted, struggling to regain control. Momentum had decisively shifted. Britain's disciplined lines, standing firm through mud, rain, and fire, now dictated the pace and scope of the engagement. France and Prussia were no longer the masters of the battlefield. They were responding to a rhythm imposed upon them. The strategic importance cannot be overstated. Britain's ability to maintain pressure and exploit the enemy's faltering confidence created cascading effects. Supply lines could be targeted. Retreats became disorganized. Opportunities for counterattack vanished as the psychological weight of facing a patient, unwavering opponent sapped initiative. And it was not always dramatic, loud, or heroic. Many of the most consequential moments were quiet. A battalion holding a hedgerow under fire, a regiment forming square against cavalry, an officer calmly reissuing orders amidst chaos. These actions reshaped the battlefield in subtle but irreversible ways. That is the reality the myth ignores. Discipline had become a weapon of consequence. Britain's forces could absorb mistakes, weather chaos, and yet press forward systematically. The enemy, by contrast, could not. Arrogance and expectation had left them ill-prepared for the methodical endurance of their opponent. What followed were visible signs of disintegration. Soldiers retreated piecemeal, lines fragmented, and coordination collapsed. These consequences were not only tactical, they were psychological. Each faltering French or Prussian unit fed uncertainty into neighboring formations. Panic became contagious. And in this environment, the British advantage multiplied without additional effort. And this is why it matters. Battles are not merely about who fires fastest or charges bravely. They are contests of preparation, endurance, and control. By understanding the consequences of discipline and psychological pressure, we see that victory was earned in ways the myth consistently overlooks. It was not flashy heroism or numbers that decided the outcome. It was methodical application of training, cohesion, and mental resilience. France and Prussia suffered not just defeat, but the disintegration of strategy under stress, revealing how crucial mental fortitude is to historical outcomes. Here's the part most people miss. The consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Britain's demonstration of discipline and endurance sent ripples through European theaters. Commanders recalibrated their tactics, morale shifted among allies and enemies, and the perception of British military competence grew quietly but decisively. Success bred psychological advantage as much as strategic gain. And all of it traced back to the relentless application of training under pressure, the invisible work that history rarely celebrates. And this is the lesson for the observer. Outcomes are never preordained. Numbers, reputation, and bravado can falter under the patient weight of discipline. Britain's success reshaped both the physical battlefield and the minds of those who faced it. It was a consequence earned step by step, volley by volley, and it is in understanding this that we finally see the full measure of their achievement. Now we confront what history often chooses to forget. The erasure is subtle but deliberate. Britain's role in these battles, the ingenuity, discipline, and endurance that determined the outcome, was consistently minimized in popular narratives. You were taught that France and Prussia simply lost because they were weaker or overmatched. That is comfortable, tidy history. It allows chroniclers to tell a story of victory without examining the methods, the psychological mastery, or the endurance that produced it. And in doing so, the contributions of British soldiers, their officers, and their careful planning are quietly sidelined. Here's the part most people miss. The myth celebrates outcome over method. It tells us Britain won, but not how. It highlights moments of apparent drama, a charge, a retreat, a heroic last stand, but glosses over the relentless preparation and disciplined cohesion that made those moments possible. Writers and historians, often influenced by politics, national sentiment, or the desire for a simple story, preferred to frame Britain's victories as inevitable. This framing diminished the subtle genius of British strategy and, intentionally or not, erased the psychological dimension of warfare. It is not that Britain's men were unremarkable. On the contrary, their achievements were extraordinary. But history rarely acknowledges what is invisible, the patient application of skill, endurance, and order under extreme stress. The erasure extends to the enemy as well. France and Prussia, cast as overconfident or inept, are often simplified into foils for British heroism. In reality, they were disciplined, capable, and sometimes brave. Yet when their lines faltered, the narrative shifted to praise British brilliance rather than acknowledge the psychological fractures that discipline and preparation had exploited. Credit was reassigned, sacrifice minimized, and the story rewritten to make the Redcoats appear almost superhuman. Authority was reversed in the recounting of events. British men did not need embellishment to succeed, they simply needed recognition that rarely came. And here's the part most people miss. Erasure also affects the lessons we draw. By ignoring the methods and endurance behind victories, popular history encourages the idea that success is a matter of chance, numbers, or superficial heroism. It obscures the real drivers of outcomes. Discipline, cohesion, psychological pressure, and relentless preparation. Students, enthusiasts, and even professional historians who rely on the simplified version fail to see the blueprint behind Britain's effectiveness. They inherit a story that is neat, satisfying, but fundamentally incomplete. The effect is cumulative. Over decades, textbooks, films, and public imagination internalize this version of history. Glorious Redcoats are celebrated, while the subtler truths, the long hours of drilling, the small decisions under stress, the psychological warfare that unmade enemy confidence, fade into obscurity. It is in this erasure that history does its quietest but most profound work. The past is rewritten, not through falsification, but through omission, and the viewer is left believing they understand when they have only glimpsed the surface. And this is why it matters. Erasure is not just about credit, It shapes memory, perception, and culture. It teaches false lessons about what succeeds on a battlefield. It glorifies numbers and audacity over discipline and endurance. It misleads about the true nature of leadership, responsibility, and human resilience. Britain's victory was methodical, psychological, and painstakingly earned, yet much of the world remembers only outcome, not process. Here's the part most people miss. Recognizing the erasure allows us to reclaim history. It allows us to see the invisible work, the quiet genius, the subtle mastery that truly decided the day. It reminds us that what is celebrated is not always what was decisive, and that human effort often goes unrecorded, even as it shapes the course of nations. Now we arrive at the verdict. The moment to draw lessons, not from myth, not from embellished tales, but from the cold, compelling reality of history. You were taught that numbers and reputation decide battles. That bold charges and heroic flurries determine outcomes. That is comforting, tidy history, but the truth is far more instructive and far more human. Discipline beats numbers, endurance beats arrogance. Britain's victories over France and Prussia were not miracles of fate. They were the result of preparation, cohesion, and the quiet, relentless application of skill under pressure. Let that sink in. Here's the part most people miss. Victory is rarely flamboyant. It does not come from a single act of bravery or a lucky cannonball. It emerges from the accumulation of small, precise actions repeated under duress. A regiment holding its square, a line of muskets fired in perfect synchrony, a commander calmly issuing orders amid chaos. These are the moments that define success. France and Prussia, despite superior numbers and training, faltered not because they were weak, but because they underestimated the patient, disciplined force before them. That is the psychological truth that history often hides. Authority is reversed here. Popular accounts suggest the enemy's failure was obvious, almost inevitable. That is misleading. The reality is that Britain's soldiers earned every advantage. Each march, each drill, each hour spent in rain, mud, or fog built the foundation for victory. The battlefield was not a stage of destiny, it was a theater of endurance. Every small decision, every disciplined action created momentum. The enemy did not simply collapse. They were outmaneuvered, outlasted, and psychologically worn down by men who had learned to maintain composure when everything seemed to collapse around them. And here's the part most people miss. The true lesson is as much about the human mind as it is about military strategy. Morale can break faster than lines of infantry. Confidence can vanish in the face of silent, relentless pressure. Britain's advantage was not in weapons alone, nor in numbers, nor in heroic gestures. It was in the ability to endure, to coordinate, to act with calm certainty, and to exploit overconfidence subtly and patiently. This is why discipline, endurance, and preparation are more powerful than audacity or bravado. It is a lesson that applies far beyond the battlefield. Consider the broader significance. The consequences of these victories reshaped Europe. Commanders took note of British methods, learning that psychological mastery could unpick numerical superiority. Nations recalibrated their tactics, knowing that discipline and endurance could define outcomes in ways that mere force could not. And yet popular history often ignores this, celebrating the drama of battle while erasing the slow, steady work that truly decided it. This erasure masks the deeper message that human effort, mental fortitude, and strategic patience often outweigh apparent advantages. And this is why it matters. By understanding the truth behind Britain's victories, we reclaim history. We see the invisible labor, the quiet genius, the subtle decisions that shaped nations. We understand that outcomes are earned, not given, that myths simplify while reality instructs. The discipline, endurance, and psychological acuity of Britain's infantry were the real weapons that outmatched France and Prussia on the 18th century battlefield. Here's the part most people miss. Recognizing this transforms how we view history. It teaches that preparation and mental fortitude can overcome numbers and arrogance. It teaches that endurance, patience, and cohesion often decide the day more than flash or spectacle. And it reminds us that history is written not just by victors, but by those who know what to see and what to record. Don't forget to subscribe to Britain at War.